morning, friends, everyone. Love to see that we have some folks from Guatemala, Peru, obviously Honduras, and I don't know if USA. We've got some Honduran, pretty much Hondurans in the USA, right? You guys have been Hondurans for a while. Honduras is home now, but you're in the States for now. And I just want to introduce Nicole. We have Nicole with us to guide us this morning through some best practices with our mission groups, our mission teams. All of that is looking quite differently anyway with COVID. So she's going to tie that all in together for us today. And Nicole serves as director of CAFO's Center on Applied Research for Vulnerable Children and Families. And she has been with CAFO for 7 years and working hard. I don't know that I ever see this girl not working on something new and big research-wise, putting out tons of amazing publications. Many of you, I'm sure, have read them to help us better our practices and do things in excellence for these kids that we love, right? And if you have not heard of CAFO before, you can just CAFO.org. And they just have a conference every year that is phenomenal, and resources, and connections. And so CAFO is a big part of Jorge and my personal journey and identity mission, and Nicole's been a big part of that as well. Prior to working with CAFO, Nicole worked as a child and family therapist. She's worked in juvenile detention, and she has worked with children with special needs. So she's going to share on mission teams today, but she actually has expertise in tons of areas that just benefits all those that know her in so many ways. Through her personal and professional life, she has gained extensive experience with foster care, adoption, residential care, trauma recovery, transitioning to family care, OVC research, and cross-cultural ministry. She has a degree in psychology, family studies, marriage and family therapy, and permanency and adoption competency. She does live with her family in Peru as a missionary. They're developing family-based care alongside government bodies and the local community. And so just a plethora of amazing experience and information for us. So Nicole, I'm going to pass it on to you, let you just jump in and get started. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Hey, well, I'm so happy to be here. And thank you to all who have put where you're joining from in the chat box. It's just fascinating to see how this group is coming together, and really a joy. And I'll just start by saying I'm so grateful for each of you and the work that you're doing. And sometimes this work can feel thankless. Maybe you get a lot of thanks, and if so, that is an excellent thing. But I think for many of us, it can feel like it's just kind of both a joy and at times a strain when you're getting middle of the night emergency calls, or you're getting, that child that is in need that's dropped off, or that family that's really struggling, and you can feel like you're pouring out, and that maybe nobody appreciates what you do. So if that's the case, that you're joining us in that state of mind today, I just want to say thank you. On behalf of, I'm sure, many people who are grateful for the work you're doing and your willingness to step in and serve, and maybe just are not in a place to be thinking about serving you through gratitude. So thankful for the work that you're doing, and really grateful to be with you today. As Tara said, I have been in this field a while. I was actually born into it. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. We won't get into that too much, because we're really going to focus today on short-term missions. One thing I want to note before we jump in is that, as she said, it's going to be recorded. There are going to be materials that we point you to. So I really want you to feel the invitation and even the encouragement to be present, rather than kind of taking lots of notes or thinking through like, okay, what am I going to do next? Just feel free to be present with it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which is always the hardest part of these presentations for me. So say a prayer. Let's see here. Why is it so hard? I don't know. Tara's seen me present when it takes me like 3 minutes, so we'll hope it doesn't go that way. All right, can everyone see that? Hey, awesome. That's great. So I wish we were having this conversation around my table. One of my mentors always teases me that like suck people in with cooking and food. But I think these conversations about caring for vulnerable kids, vulnerable populations are best had like over a cup of coffee or some soup, you know, just we're all in this together, just nourishing and nurturing. And so imagine that that's the situation we're in. But I'm going to go ahead and just jump in with some housekeeping. If possible, it's great if you can keep your video on, mute your audio, and then as we go along, if you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat box. So at the end of our time together, we'll have a Q&A, and I want to make sure that this is really tailored to what you want to learn. So go ahead, put those questions in the chat box, and then we'll have time to talk about those later. There are different options for seeing the screen. You can use a split screen if you want. Sometimes that's a little bit more engaging than just seeing the slides, but totally up to you. So with that, I do want to address one thing before we jump in. And it's that this may spark some big emotions for you. Of all the different topics that I speak on regularly, this is the one that can make people cry, make people have this like revelation, can make people hate me. So I'm just going to invite you in this moment to feel free to acknowledge those emotions. Notice what might be coming up for you. It might be realization, it might be guilt or regret or frustration or anger. It could be a number of different things. So just know that that's a really normal experience if you end up having that experience. And I invite you to notice those emotions, but also commit to not getting sucked into them. Sort of suspend any judgment on yourself, on anyone else for a while. And when we're done with the presentation, notice in yourself what you're feeling at that moment too, okay? So the former psychologist in me says those emotions are super powerful and they can quickly become a distraction, but they can also serve as an indicator of kind of what we might want to process together or individually. So what I'd like everyone to do is in the chat box, and I'm gonna actually ask Tara to go ahead and just read those. Drop 3 words. I want you to think of 3 words that mean short-term missions to you. When you think of short-term missions, what are 3 kind of concepts, ideas, pictures that come up for you? And they can look a lot of different ways, but I want to hear from your perspective before we jump in what this looks like. And then Tara, as those go in there, please feel free to just yell them out.
Education, engagement, and advocacy.
Great.
Connection.
We have more than one person, so I'm waiting. Come on, guys.
Connections. This one's good. Sunscreen, bug spray, and candy.
True words.
Spirituality, service, relationships, ripple effects, small teams. Serving, youth groups. Service, heat, exhausting, helpful. Food, culture, praying. Service, education, new connections. To serve, to understand, to love in action, love, lots of water. Friendship, intensity.
That's great.
Bless and connection. Ministry of presence.
That's good. That's good. Diverse group, diverse thoughts here. Some that are more practical, some that are more theoretical, some that are more positive, some that are more challenging. That sounds a lot like what we're going to get into today. So I'm grateful for that. I want to, before we jump in, to tell you a little bit about my story and my relationship to short-term missions. I think it's really important that you understand I come at this as a learner who's made mistakes. And yes, I do research on short-term missions and vulnerable kids. And at the same time, that is definitely not the dominant hat I wear, because my experiences are much more related to the short-term missions trips I've taken. So I grew up in a family that fosters and adopts. In fact, my parents at this current moment have 5 little kids, like under the age of 8, that they just adopted, because they're great and they're crazy. And so adoption and fostering is so a part of our life. It's, it's been, in fact, when I was a little kid, I lived in an orphanage, I lived in residential care. So kind of have experienced it in a multitude of ways. I'm getting confused looks. My parents were house parents. I lived with my biological parents as they were house parents in residential care. And then we did foster care and adoption. And interestingly, I always knew my entire life that kids were to be in families wherever possible. I always knew that. Like, it wasn't even a conversation. It was just living in action, right? And it was an interesting thing when I became an adult and I started to engage in short-term missions trips. And I just saw that for me, in hindsight, there were certain things that I thought were okay on short-term missions trips that I wouldn't have thought were okay in my home culture. I would have thought they were inappropriate or not helpful or whatever. And so all throughout high school and into college, I did, lots of like 1 and 2 week kind of summer missions, that sort of thing. But once I got married to my husband, quickly after that, we moved to Africa. And so in 2009 and 2010, we lived in Africa, in Namibia. And we call it our reconnaissance mission. We now live overseas long term, but at that time it was a lot of learning, a lot of messing up, a lot of mistakes, a lot of like great things and hard things in just this big mix that was hard to tease apart. And so I'll just share a couple of stories there. To set the context, we were there much of the year by ourselves. We didn't have a team. We had come with a team, but then everybody had left. And we were working in 3 primary projects. One was at a youth program. One was at a Native-led foster care organization, which is like a whole other God story. And then one was at a preschool for orphans and vulnerable children, so kids that are ages like 2 to 4. And the 2 stories that I often share related to this that were like my aha moments that something was a little awry one was related to this kiddo here, who was brought to a day camp we were doing at the youth center. And basically anytime there wasn't school, we would open up this youth center as just a way to care for kids, to give them a safe place to go, kind of engage them with learning and social activities and snacks and the gospel and all of these things, right? And somebody came up and this little kiddo was crying and put her in my arms, saw me, kind of knew me from different things in the neighborhood, put her in my arms, never have met her. She spoke a completely different dialect than what we had learned. We couldn't even speak to each other. But she was just kind of weeping. She wasn't sobbing. She was just like quietly and slowly weeping. And I'm going, what is going on? This is really strange. So here I am holding this kid, and she was with me the whole day. Klung only wanted to sit on my lap. And I knew enough about attachment to know something was off. Well, I came to find out at the end of the day that her mom had passed away the night before. And that made her a double orphan. Her dad had passed away as well. And the neighbor didn't know what to do, so he brought her to this camp. And I couldn't put my finger on all the dynamics, but I just knew like something about this is terribly wrong. The fact that this little kiddo who obviously needs lots of support has been brought to me in this more short-term context. Something is not right. And so let's just like table that story for 1 minute, okay? The second story is we've been working at this orphanage preschool, right? And it was a really interesting situation. I feel like I could talk about it for hours and I won't. But there was one little boy who adored my husband, and my husband Josh went to the preschool more frequently than I did. And there was this little boy, lots of little boys who like craved a godly man investing in them, paying attention to them, caring about them, of course. But this one in particular, like, repeatedly would ask, would we take him? Could he go home with us? That sort of a situation. And we thought it was great. Like, we were investing in him, right? He didn't have a healthy home life. He lived with an extended relative who was not very kind to him. And we felt like we were doing this right and good thing by investing in his life. And so it was our last day there when we're driving, like we're getting ready to drive away, and we've told all the kids bye and we've like prepped them all. And he is sobbing and clinging to my husband's leg and screaming. And the director of the preschool is like peeling him off. And all of a sudden we're driving away, both just sobbing and going, what have we done? And of course, it was all done with good intentions. We went there to love people and love kids in the name of Christ, and to build them up and care for them and nurture them and hopefully empower them. And we had all the best intentions. We even had quite a bit of training, and we still really messed it up. And so I left that experience of about a year, going home and thinking, this is just messed up. Like, international service trips, why are we doing this? And feeling very negative about it, thinking surely this is not right. And in reality, this last 10 years has been this journey of seeing, yes, short-term missions brings with it tremendous potential for harm. But if done well and wisely planned and led, it can also bring with it tremendous potential for good. And now I really see that there are situations in which short-term missions can fill needs. They can empower long-term ministry. They can help cultivate relationships. They can be done for good. So that's what we want to talk about today. What are the challenges and the risks, and what can we do to minimize risk of harm and optimize the potential for good? Okay. So with that, let's talk a little bit about our agenda. Sorry, I think I'm having like a minor allergic reaction, so bear with me. Probably just dust or whatever. All right, so scope and purpose. We'll start there. Like, what are short-term missions? What should we be aiming at as the purpose of short-term missions? And then what are some of the benefits and concerns, especially as it relates to vulnerable children and families? So we'll kind of get that bigger picture, but we're going to narrow into the vulnerable children and family space because that's where most of us live, right? And then we'll hit on some research, some empirical research, so you know, like, this isn't the webinar of Nicole made this stuff up, but it actually comes from evidence, okay? And then we'll hit on some principles for good practice. So what do we want to see in our short-term mission trips? Let's not camp out on what's not going well. Let's say these are the things that we actually want to do. And within that, we'll do some kind of alternative models. So if you're doing A and it's not really working out so well, how can you do B by making a few tweaks? Finally, we'll do a little bit on COVID-19, which is kind of the golden question of the hour, right? How is COVID-19 going to impact short-term missions, and what can we do with it? And then finally, we'll have our time of Q&A. So let's jump in. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for us to interact together. And again, I encourage you, as ideas come up, as questions come up, even as you're saying, hey, that's great, but in my situation, how would you handle this? Go ahead and just send those to Tara, or just drop them in the chat box, however you want to do it. All right, so big picture. Let's start like at the top of the funnel and narrow down in. We're going to talk about the scope of short-term international volunteering. There are really 6 main types. Now, you might say like, oh, I know another one, an exception. Great, cool, there are some. But for now, we'll just kind of camp out on these 6 main types. There are 6 main reasons or motivations that people go to do short-term international volunteering, including short-term missions. Number 1 is religious. That's going to be our short-term missions camp, right? That's all in there. Number 2 is educational. So think of your, like, you know, colleges that do service learning trips. Think of even high schools that take teams. A gap year, that's where somebody leaves high school and instead of going to work or to college, they take 1 year to volunteer, see the world, that sort of thing. Fourth is just related to travel. Very frequently, people will go on, let's say, a safari, and they'll say, well, hey, I want to take a day to volunteer at an orphanage or with a homeless shelter or something like that. I want to do good as part of my travel. The next one would be disaster relief. So that can be something that's like a natural disaster or a geopolitical conflict, a refugee situation. And then finally, trips that are skills-based. So trips that are maybe medical missions or engineers who are building things, or those types of things, where oftentimes there's an element also of skills transfer, where maybe it's a nurse who's teaching another nurse a new skill, that sort of a thing. Incredibly, there are 2 million volunteers every year. Well, probably not this year, okay? Like, generally, there are 2 million volunteers a year that serve in this type of a trip, in this sort of short-term international volunteering. And that's just from the United States alone. We don't have global numbers, but I would estimate, just anecdotally, it's probably about double that. So around 4 million people that are leaving their nation to go volunteer in another nation. And very frequently, it is people leaving high income nations to go to low to middle income nations. I think, that is just an important dynamic that we'll come back to later about sort of the higher income nations going to the lower income nations, okay? So purposes of short-term missions, we're gonna go real broad, and this is the short-term mission specific. This is kind of religiously motivated short-term trips. Some really healthy reasons to do them and really healthy objectives is listening, learning, building relationships, supporting long-term ministry, and seeing what God is doing in the world. Teach on these topics. These 5 things are kind of the hallmarks of, like, these are what we should be setting up our teams and to expect. They may come in with a lot of different expectations that we can talk about a little bit later, but we want to craft our trips around these objectives. Who are they listening to? Because you know what, especially with Americans, and I can say this because I am one, we sure like to talk. We want to come in, we want to be the teacher, we want to be the person with the answers, we want to be doing all sorts of things, right? And really, one of the best things we can do is cierren los bocas and just listen, okay? Learning. This is often underestimated. Again, we want to teach, but what can we learn? What can we learn from cultural experience? What can we learn from leaders who have been there long term, local ministries? What can we learn from the children and families we hope to serve? Building relationships. Now, one caveat here is, what I don't mean by building relationships is kind of one volunteer to one child relationships. We'll talk about attachment later and why that can be really challenging. But what I'm talking about here is maybe a relationship between a church and an NGO, a relationship between a pastor in the States and a pastor in Honduras, a relationship between a family in nation A and a family in nation B that can be very mutual. Supporting long-term ministry. Oftentimes the things we hope to accomplish in a short-term mission can't be done in 2 weeks, okay? But we can work with long-term ministry to empower them to be able to do it better. And then finally, to connect the big C church, so not like our church congregation, but like the church around the world, to what God is doing in other places. That can be one of the most powerful dynamics in a believer's life, and we certainly would never want to deprive anyone of that. Okay, really clearly and bluntly, there are some things that short-term missions trips are not meant to do. They're not going to fix things. We're not going to take a 2-week team and sort of fix generational cycles of poverty or racism or colonialism or deprivation or oppression or whatever. So you'll hear people and they'll say things like, I'm going on this trip to rescue. No, you're not. You're going on the trip to learn and listen and be part of something. It's not to dominate. It's to be part of and come alongside. So I hit on that rescue theme. I think, that's often used in different language and different messaging. That's really not what short-term missions are about. They're not about funding something. I'll share a little story here. This is kind of a discouraging story, but just go with me here. So while we lived in Africa, we sort of inherited a short-term team. These were amazing people, really amazing people. And when they left, they had raised a little bit of extra money and they gave it to a certain organization. And they gave it to this organization for the purpose of buying land. This organization would have been better off probably if they would have had a different site, okay? The problem was there, of course, were annual taxes related to that land. And there was no way that this organization was going to be able to fund that. So they gave them the land, and unfortunately, they could never buy the land because they knew that they couldn't pay to have the land. And we had actually known another situation where somebody did buy the land, and after 2 years they lost it because they couldn't pay the taxes on it. So there's often these like really good intentions about how we, as people maybe from higher income countries, can bring money to lower income countries and kind of fund things in a short-term trip. A short-term trip cannot be a standalone means for funding. Now you can, through a short-term trip, again, come alongside a longer-term ministry, and that can be an incredible opportunity for funding partnership. But in terms of doing it in the context only of a short-term trip, there's a lot of unhealthy things that can emerge. The final trend is short-term missions are not just to add passport stamps. I'm sure you've all seen situations in which people are talking about like, yeah, I've been to 23 nations in the last 5 years on short-term missions. And what I would question in that situation is, are you making the kind of long-term impact in those areas you want to? Or could we talk about going narrow and deep? Like really investing wisely and prudently in a key or a couple of key relationships in one location and going deep. So don't be like this guy that you see here with his like fancy, I've been all these places shirts. That's not short-term missions, guys. That's not the point. All right, so let's talk about some of the benefits, because what it can quickly seem like when we're having these conversations is like, sometimes I hear from people like, we're just trying to do good and everyone's telling us we're doing it wrong. Not the intention at all. And hopefully by the end of today, you'll be leaving with some tools that are really practical to help you do short-term missions well. But some of the potential benefits of short-term missions, we're going to kind of divide them into two categories, right? And you can read them, but we'll go through a few of them. Some of them are to volunteers, and actually in research literature, many people suggest that some of the benefits to volunteers really might outweigh benefits to intended beneficiaries. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but sometimes people are motivated to do short-term volunteering because they want to build their resume. They like to feel good about doing good. Like that's an okay thing. Sometimes we're like, oh, we shouldn't feel good about doing good. It's cool. That's how God made us. It's fine. Or to see new cultures, have new perspectives. Lots of times churches will say things like, we really love short-term missions because we send our congregants on them, and it's an act of discipleship. It can kind of light a spark in them to be really serious about who Jesus is in their lives and how they want to live out the practice of caring for vulnerable people or of serving him or what have you. So those are all super good things. And we want to acknowledge that and affirm that short-term missions can have these benefits to volunteers. When we're talking about intended beneficiaries, what I mean by that is the people you want to benefit. Like when you go on a short-term missions trip, ostensibly, it's not just to benefit your team. You want to benefit, whether it might be a church in a specific country. You might want to benefit vulnerable families. You might want to benefit school children. You might want to benefit an orphanage, whatever that is. That's your intended beneficiary, okay? So for them, you might be able to bring some learning, some healthy relationships, some skills. You might be able to do some skills transfer. Like we had said with the medical situation, you might have a team of nurses who know how to do, I'm not medical, but like some sort of special blood drawing technique. I don't know, make it up. you know, in your head. And all of a sudden, they're able to teach people. So that can be a really great thing. It can be an encouragement to long-term local ministries. I mean, I'll tell you what, one time we received this short-term team, and it was a couple, and they were with us for 3 days. They just wanted to see ministry. They wanted to meet people. And this is going to sound crazy, but we lived in this super dry desert. It was ridiculously hot, like it would get to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And you just kind of felt like burned all the time to some extent, like just kind of parched, you know? And this woman, every day at a certain time, she would make us a chai tea and like ice it and bring it to us and sit down, and she just wanted to hear stories. And as people who hadn't spoken English in a super long period of time, it was so refreshing, and we felt like it was just like this huge shot in the arm. So she did this tiny thing to encourage long-term people, and it just gave so much more energy. So encouraging local ministries, encouraging long-term missionaries, offering new ideas. Sometimes you're coming in from the outside, you might see a new perspective. Now we want to be careful about this, because sometimes as external people, we can be like, I see the problem so clearly, let me just fix it. Doesn't really work like that. But sometimes we might have a nugget of information, or maybe we have, you know, a new technological skill or whatever, something that we could just share and say, hey, have you considered this? Like, this might be a little assistance to you. Financial partnership for long-term ministries. Let's just put this one on the table, okay? Because if you are an organization who is receiving short-term teams, you're not doing it because it's easy, because it takes tons of energy. Now, it can definitely be an encouragement, but it can be absolutely exhausting. And I feel like if we were in church, I would be like, can I get an amen? Because if you've hosted short-term teams, you'll know, like, it can be really tricky. But one of the reasons we do that is to engage with our like Western-based partners. If we're, you know, if we're German and they're based in Germany or whatever, we do that to engage with them, to help them catch the vision, so that they pray, so that they give, so that they advocate for us. And pretending that that's not part of it, like, we don't need to do that, okay? We can just be honest that that's part of why we have short-term missions, and that is actually okay, okay? So financial partnership for long-term ministries can be a great benefit. And then actually sometimes teams coming can help benefit the local economy. I know lots of different organizations that will take their teams like to a market. The market vendors appreciate this. They're grateful. So that can be another benefit. We also have some concerns with short-term missions, and we'll just be honest about those as well. We have some general concerns that are broader, and then we have some that are specific to orphans and vulnerable children. Some of the broader ones can be things like economic displacement. So that's the idea that you bring a pile of shoes or a pile of school books or whatever, and that can be really great on the surface. However, it might be putting people who make those things out of business. Or you come and you build a barn, let's say, or a shed, okay? And that's really needed by a local ministry. But at the same time, those local people that could be hired to do that project aren't having that source of income and that source of dignity. So that can be one concern that's often brought up. A second is the language barrier. Lots of people will say, hey, I'm just going there for 2 weeks. Doesn't matter if I can converse. Now, I mean, they don't need to be experts or anything, but if you can't speak the language at all, it can be really challenging. Undertrained volunteers. So here's an example. A med student, a medical school student, not a doctor, a medical school student, goes somewhere and performs a surgery unsupervised. People who don't have the right credentialing, they don't have the right skills, they think, oh, well, I can still help. Like, I know it pretty much. But lots of really risky things can come out of that. Or you may have a trauma situation where a child or an adult has been traumatized and somebody thinks, well, I've taken a couple of counseling classes, surely that's good enough. Not quite. The sustainability of it. What does it look like if we go in as short-termers and maybe start projects? Sometimes that happens. And then leave and it kind of ends. The cost, some people will say, well, if you're raising $2,000 to go for 2 weeks, why don't you send the money? Now, maybe there are situations in which that's true. I would argue there are situations in which it can be a really good use of funds to have short-term teams, but that is one concern or one thing that people question. Power differentials. This is a situation where, let's give an example. If I have a church that is supporting my ministry and they say that they want to come and send a short-term team, and I know that for whatever reason, it's not a great time for that to happen. It'd be better if we waited 6 months, but maybe I don't feel like I have the power to say no or pause. Maybe I feel like because they're giving us money or because they're advocating for us, that I need to say yes. So that's a power differential, is when I don't feel like I'm on equal footing with you, and I don't feel, or you don't feel like we both have the ability to say no or communicate honestly. And then finally is exploitation. There are times in which short-term missions can become exploitative when, just kind of imagine, like, how many people have you seen post different things on social media related to short-term missions, and is it always safe for kids and families and things like that? And sometimes there are NGOs, there are other service providers who are less well-intentioned, who maybe actually don't have good intentions, who are trying to draw people in via short-term volunteering, and maybe they're charging a lot of money, maybe they're running it as a business, that sort of a thing that can be really unhealthy. So for today, I'm gonna just blatantly assume that none of us on this call today are in that boat, but I'm guessing each of you can think of somebody who maybe gets close to that line. In terms of things that are specific to orphans and vulnerable children, that's what I mean by OVC. So we have lots of issues with child protection and short-term missions. We just did a study of almost 400 individuals. And of those 400 individuals, most of them had gone on short-term missions trips. Am I lagging? Okay, good. Most of them had gone on short-term missions trips, and around 2/3 of them had volunteered in an orphanage and had done so supervised. So they were with the kids by themselves, like off in a room by themselves with a kid or whatever. And you may think to yourself, like, oh, these are good people, they're church-going people. I can tell you lots of stories of how people who were well-intentioned were on teams with people who weren't well-intentioned. And oftentimes, maltreatment of kids flies under the radar, and people might say things like, oh, well, I know that guy, like, surely he's fine. It might not be the case. Attachment is another thing. So I've totally done this. This is not me calling anyone out, but you go to an orphanage, you like home in on one kid. You decide you like love this kid. They're so important to you. You spend tons of time with them. You hug them, you hold them, you tell them how great they are, and you build this bond. And then at the end of 2 weeks, you're gone. I've totally done that. I have a huge scrapbook of Josefina in Mexico, and Josefina doesn't have any clue who I am. But in that moment, it felt very special to me. I didn't realize that there was risk of harm, okay? Commodification, so that's sort of this idea, back to the exploitation of kind of using kids at times. Organizations, entities may use them for certain purposes, like maybe you're having kids, you're saying you all have to like tell your stories of how you became an orphan, or you need to do a dance routine or sing for our guests, and like maybe they don't feel like they want to, but it can kind of cross that line into they're part of the experience. Confidentiality, this is a big one. For vulnerable kids, their stories often have lots of hard things, lots of trauma, lots of issues, and lots of children's homes or organizations working with them may encourage them to share that, and maybe they want to keep that private. So really just protecting kids from having to share any more than what they would typically share. Sharing cash and gifts, we'll get into that later. Making false promises, even ones we intend to keep. I'll come back for you, I'll adopt you, things like that get said a lot and then can't be followed through on. And finally, instability. This is one lots of people haven't thought of, so if you have not, you are not alone. But I want you to think of the instability that kids in vulnerable situations can encounter. Maybe they're in a vulnerable family and they've lived lots of different places because they get evicted regularly. Maybe they're living in a children's home and the caregivers change, and so do the kids who come in and out. You know, maybe a kid leaves because they get adopted or they reintegrate with mom and dad. Maybe new kids come because they've been removed from the home. There's tons of instability that the average child in a safe, loving family would not experience. And so given the fact that kids are experiencing that in their regular lives, it makes us question whether having strangers introduced regularly into their kind of their little system is a good idea. Okay. All right. So what does research suggest? We're just going to hit on 5 things. And I've sent most of these papers to Tara so she can send them out in the post-recording email. But one of them, this one here with Howard, Roberts, Gustafson, and Wilke, we just submitted it, so it's not available. But basically, short-term volunteering, especially in residential care, is considered to not be in the best interest of children and youth. Now, before anyone freaks out and says, now what am I going to do? We're actually going to get to what you're going to do. If you have a children's home, an orphanage, an albergue, whatever you all call it, okay, and you are bringing short-term teams there, never fear, it's going to be fine. Lots of opportunities. And then short-term volunteering may commodify children outside parental care. We've kind of talked about that. One of the things we found recently is that direct interaction with orphans and vulnerable children does not lead to greater trip satisfaction for participants. So lots of times trip organizers, whether that's a children's home, an NGO, a church, whatever, they'll say, well, we have to do this because otherwise our volunteers would be upset. They only come so they can play with the kids. Actually, in a study of almost 400 people, that's not what we found at all. We did find that 67% of volunteers who were in orphanages volunteered in the kids' home space unsupervised. So they were not supervised at all times, which creates a lot of concerns, right? And then finally, that volunteering in residential care may lead to short-term attachments that are formed and broken and can worsen attachment challenges. Okay, so one question I'll just ask simply, because some of you might be feeling like, ooh, this is a lot of information. How do I organize this? Easiest thing for me to say when you're thinking about what do we want to do is just reverse the roles and say, what if this were my kid? Like, think of your child or a kid that you love deeply, a niece, a nephew, neighbor, mentee, whatever, and think, if they were in this situation, would I want this short-term team coming? And that will kind of offer some clarity most of the time, where we're like, oh, aha, and what would you want done instead? So let's go from there. And I'm going to say something really controversial, and I just ask you, don't leave yet, okay? Because it's something that I want you to have kind of on repeat, cycling through in your head if you're thinking about short-term missions. Because sometimes we think to ourselves, especially if we're in the church community or we're an NGO leader, we'll think like, yeah, well, this is really good for the people that are part of my congregation. Or, yeah, well, this is really good for volunteers, and it brings in 30% of our income each year or whatever. It helps keep the doors open so we can care for vulnerable kids and families. Hey, those are both super great things, okay? We want to encourage them, honestly. But one thing we will say is that children are never a means to an end, okay? Children are never a means to an end. And I know for some of us, it can be like a gut punch. And so if you've done things, again, if feelings are coming up, if you've done things and you're like, man, oh, that wasn't the best, don't get stuck there. We're going to move towards what we can do, okay? But think to yourself as you're planning your trips. You know, there have been so many times that I've talked to people and they'll say things like, well, we had 2 teams come in a row, and by the second team, the kids in the home were so sick and tired of it, they didn't want them to come. And so we had to bribe them. Like, if you just, like, we'll do this trip, participate, you know, whatever, and then we'll take you to the pool. Or like, then we'll take you to the movies. Like, that sort of we know you hate this. And so if they're at that point of feeling burned out, we want to think about, like, is this really in the best interest of children? So we want to form trips that are actually about being good for children and families, that are going to bring good to children and families. And then kind of the second piece is, now we've figured out how a trip brings good to children and families. Now how can we bring good to the volunteers, okay? And it can totally be done with both, all right? So you're thinking, now what? She just ripped away the way that we do short-term missions. Thanks a whole lot. Now what? Well, I'm going to tell you a couple of things, and I'm also going to remind you that you are in an excellent time. Probably the best time to do this that we've ever had. Because typically, if you're making changes to your short-term missions, you have like the steady stream of people that are coming, or you have the church that comes year to year to year, and they're already going to be expecting changes because of the global pandemic. They're going to say, oh, things are going to change, things are going to look different. Just add on a few more changes. They won't even notice. Like it'll just flow just fine. So now is a great time to think about making changes. All right, I'm going to jump in with 8 key principles, but these are taken from our guidance document on short-term missions, why short-term missions, that Tara sent to you. So we're just going to add a little bit more color there, and don't feel the need to take notes. It's already all written down. First, we'll talk about protection. Number one thing we want to do as short-term missions teams or volunteers or leading teams is make sure we're not introducing harm. I mean, we hope to introduce good, and sometimes inadvertently we introduce harm, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen. So what are we going to do? Like some key things, just real simple things. We're going to make sure that any organization we're volunteering with, we're going to make sure our own organization has a child protection policy. Interestingly, if you don't, we just made a module on how to do this with an actual template that tells you exactly the types of things you need to talk through with your board, with your staff. It tells you everything you need to know. So if you need that, it is free. It's actually translated into Spanish if you need it in Spanish. So let Tara know, and she can let me know, or I can send it to her, or whatever. We want to make sure you have that. But that outlines for you, like, what is appropriate behavior, what's not, what's our code of conduct, what are the consequences if somebody does something they shouldn't do. So we want to have that in writing, okay? The next thing is we want to make sure that every single person interacting with vulnerable kids is screened. I'll tell you what's not enough. Going, oh, so-and-so has always volunteered with our church or with our team, that's good enough, right? Totally not good enough. So before I did this role, I worked as a trauma therapist, mostly with kids who had been in institutions, whether it was like juvenile detention centers. Some kids had been in children's homes. Some kids had been in adoption and foster care. But basically, this topic came up very frequently, the short-term teams thing, especially where kids were unsupervised. So, or sorry, where teams were unsupervised, volunteers were unsupervised. So we want to make sure we're doing background check, reference screening, that type of thing, to make sure it's not just our first impressions of the individual, but we're really making sure they're safe for kids to be around. And then we definitely want to establish systems of reporting, both for the team members, yes, but for the kids. Do kids know what to do? Something bad happens, something makes them feel uncomfortable. Who do they tell? And so that would just be like 3 real quick things that you can think about as you're setting up healthy short-term missions. The next thing we want to think about is attachment. So attachment, to just drill down real basically, is it's the emotional bond that happens when a primary caregiver meets a child's needs across time. So think of babies and moms. If they're in an intact family, when a baby cries, mom and dad meet the baby's needs. They check, do you need to eat? Do you need a diaper change? Do you need to be held, rocked, burped, whatever? You, like, if you're a parent, you know, you go through that list really fast because you just want them to stop screaming and crying, but you're there to meet their need. And that's a biological mechanism that was put in us from creation. We are made to connect because we're made in God's image, okay? And God himself is a triune God, one of relationship. So we're made for relationship. And when that doesn't happen, when a baby's needs are not being met by their primary caregiver, it sets up this mental model for them that says the world isn't safe. It says I can't trust grown-ups to meet my needs. I can't trust anyone. And that persists through their relationships throughout their life and often manifests itself in a variety of behavioral situations, okay? So we want to protect that attachment with all we've got. Child protection first, protecting attachment second. And within that, we can think about a few things. Number one, and this is a really easy one, is making sure that if a team is interacting with vulnerable kids, we're teaching them how to redirect any bids for affection. Like, you know, there's kind of this like common dynamic that a team goes to an orphanage and like all the kids come running, right? And the team feels great, of course, like we're so important, they love us so much. But in reality, those kids are looking for attention and affection, and that team's gonna be gone in 2 weeks. So we want to redirect them to the caregivers that can nurture them and protect them long-term, okay? And we can do that really simply. We don't, of course, want to turn our backs and be like, no, I won't interact with you. That's not ideal either, okay? But like stick out your hand, give them a handshake, give them a high five. Talk to your local partners to make sure you know if a handshake or a high five is culturally appropriate. But like whatever the kind of informal greeting, that's pretty good. And then we can kind of take them back to their caregivers. If they're wanting more affection than that, it doesn't come from us because we're like the visitor, right? We're the visitor. Couple other things to think about is like the repeating, making and breaking those bonds is really unhealthy. This is what's crazy. Do you know that kids can start to bond with caregivers or caregiver figures within a matter of days? We have evidence that suggests that. And so we want to be careful. Some people will be like, well, I'm only going for a week anyway. They won't bond with me. And they could. So we want to just be careful that we're not like homing in on one child. Let's say that you're doing a trip through a church and you're doing some sort of camp. Like interacting with all the different kids kind of equally is really great. Making sure we're not just homing in on one child. And then finally, we want to think about limiting our interaction between volunteers and children birth to 3. They're developmentally too young to understand the coming and going of teams. And so we want to just make sure that we're protecting them from any confusion right off the bat. Next, we have caregivers. So start with what best supports caregivers. Caregivers are the ones that are there long-term. By caregivers, I mean parents and other caregivers. Can be adoptive parents, foster parents, kinship caregivers. So like extended family, neighbors, whoever's taking care of this kiddo, these are the ones that we want to be building up because they're the ones that care for the kid long-term. Back when I was a psychologist, I used to only work with kids if they were with their families. And the reason that I would say this, I would say to their parents, like, there are 168 hours in the week, and I'm with your kid like what, 3-6 hours, something like that per week. You're with them the rest of the time. So my job is to coach you in how to work with them because you're the one that they love, they depend on, and they need you more than they need me. So same thing when it comes to volunteering. What can we do to build up the caregivers? First thing is to ask them. We like to make assumptions sometimes, right? Where we're like, oh, surely what they need is X, Y, or Z. Well, what do they want? What do they like? It's interesting. One study showed that caregivers in children's homes, what they actually craved was more playtime with the kids. And everybody thought for sure they would want to say, oh, we want to break, we want to go out, we want to leave. No, they said we actually want to play with the kids and have just like positive time where we're not disciplining or cooking or cleaning or whatever. So don't make assumptions about what parents and caregivers want. Go ahead and ask them, usually through your long-term partner, right? And then only interacting with kids ever with the approval of parents and children. Parents always have the right to say no every single time. It doesn't matter if you go to their house and you're imagining you're going to do a home visit or whatever. If they say no, they're the bosses. So you just graciously say, well, hey, thanks for being honest with us. Thanks for letting us know. We are so grateful to support you in any way possible. But at the end of the day, we as short-term volunteers are never entitled to interaction with kids or families. They are the ones who are in charge. Okay, next is community. So the community is there all the time. And investing in the local community and those local churches, local NGOs who are there indefinitely, in perpetuity, forever, that's a huge bang for your buck, as you might say, when it comes to short-term volunteering. Like, what can we do to invest in the community? I'll give you an example. We'll talk about this a little later with our alternatives. One of the most successful things I've seen with short-term trips is simply taking that which you might do in an orphanage and moving it into the community. So imagine you're having a short-term team that's going to come to do a VBS, that's pretty common, or an English class, okay? And instead of having it happen in the home, you're going to go find a church to partner with, and we're now going to do it through the local church. Now the church is the hero. Now the local community has the opportunity to come to the church, to be part of it. The kids from the children's home can still absolutely come. Their caregivers can still absolutely come to this event, but it's about integrating into the community. It's about making those relationships. And so how can we build up the community more broadly as part of our short-term trips? And then another thing to think about community-wise is how can we use our trips to build up local leaders? So whether that's teaching them a new skill, whether that's kind of helping with whatever they would be typically working on so that they can go get some training, or maybe it's doing a sort of a soul care retreat for local leaders, or a marriage event for local leaders, so that they have bigger and better capacity to better serve their community long after you leave. Expectations is another big one. And this is one like people really don't want to talk about because it can feel really yucky. Lots of people go into trips with big expectations about how they might serve or rescue or save. Or, you know, one example is a woman I knew, and she had always dreamed of going to a children's home and rocking babies. And she ended up participating in a trip with a transition home for young adult women. And it took a lot of working with her on her expectations and just realizing why her going in and doing that for 1 week could actually have some harmful effects. But that by going, and she actually was she worked at a university, and she worked in like an interview, like a career prep type thing. And so she worked with people all the time, teaching them how to interview for jobs. So she went on this short-term trip and ended up working with all these young adults, teaching them interview skills. And it was incredibly powerful. But she had to adjust her expectations. So when you're working with your teams, you want to help them adjust their expectations before they leave their home country, okay? This is not something you want to be dealing with when they're standing in front of you in Honduras or in Guatemala, and they're saying, hey, you know what, but I thought I was going to do such and such. Nope, before they get on the plane, you want to walk them through this. And just the other thing is just making sure that they understand there are lots of last minute changes and disappointments, and expectations often change in these short-term trips. So if we can prep them ahead of time, it's massively helpful. Working on that in country is always a bit of a mess. So, all right. The next one is partnership. This is really huge, and I've already heard some good stories about some of the different things people do with partnership on this call even. Some of you are familiar to me. I think that every missions trip, short-term missions trip, needs to start with conversations with your on-the-ground partner long before you ever go. And so if you are that on-the-ground partner, make sure that you get to have lots of input before that team kind of hands you their expectations, and they say, hey, this is what we're hoping for. This is what we plan to do. Put us to work. But that happens all the time, right? Where we think, as a team member, we think, gosh, I could do this. I'd be really good at this, and I'd like to do this. Surely this NGO or this church that we're going to be working this with would love this. And instead, it, maybe isn't always that helpful. So making sure that we're rooting all service in long-term relationship. We're not just going to a different organization every year. We're not going with a different church every year. In fact, I know several NGOs that will only work with a certain number of churches, and they have expectations about how frequently those churches are contacting them and things like that. So it's not just, hey, we'll take everybody and anyone, but rather let's really assess whether this is a good partnership. Does that make sense? We want to do the work ahead of time to make sure this is something that is a fit, a mutually beneficial fit for both sides. And here's like a real well-kept secret. It's okay to say no to a potential partnership. In fact, it's good and right. You will not have healthy partnerships with every single person that you come to. So go ahead, assess fit, and then be able to say, yes, this works for us. This would be great. Or, I think we have different ideas, and that's okay. This can just wreak havoc on any trip. I have a good friend. She's lived in Mexico for like 20 years. Recently, last year, they had done a short-term trip, and she and I were messaging, and she was talking about how they were working with this particular team, and this team was unwilling to eat any of the local food. And so what they had said is they were like, we can totally just have peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. It doesn't need to be fancy. So they're thinking to themselves, we're being so nice. We don't want them to go out of their way to make local food. But those of us who live in Latin America know peanut butter and jelly can be really expensive and really hard to come by. So they're thinking we're doing this NGO a favor when in fact it was putting tons of pressure. So even in those little things, it's really valuable for us to map things out with our partners ahead of time. And of course, in the big things as well. All right, 2 more principles for good practice. The next is training. And there's all sorts of things you can learn about with training. Number 1, we should do it. We should do it before people get on the plane. We should do it with the input of local partners, okay? If it's just somebody from their hometown, a lot of times churches will have missions teams, and it's what's the criteria for leading a missions team? You've been on one before. Great, that doesn't make you an expert. So we wanna make sure that we have input from local people on what types of skills, what types of, even things like, how do you greet somebody? What are the offensive gestures? What words should you not say? Those types of things, but definitely training on all of these pieces: attachment, child protection, how do we support caregivers? One thing I will say is we will be sharing a link to a free training. If any of you want to do it for your teams that are coming, it's free. We can set up a group for you. It's based on all of these principles, and basically it takes about 2 hours to go through. And then we suggest that, of course, you have a lot of discussion afterwards. So you shouldn't just send somebody go to this training for a couple hours, the self-paced training, and then that'll be all. We do have some questions that we suggest you would do with your team so that you can set up some really robust discussion. But if you don't have a training, try that one. If you do have a training, super. Just make sure that you're doing training before, during, and after the trips. And you might say, well, why would we do training after? If you are an NGO, if you're a church who's bringing in teams, those people can help advocate for you. They can help teach people what they've been learning while they're with you. And so especially if you're in a fundraising position, one of the most valuable things you can do is train up the people that come into how to advocate for people to support your organization. And again, we're not going to get all weirded out by tying short-term missions to money. That's part of it, and it's okay. And then finally, media. Lots of people don't talk about media, and I'm not exactly sure why, but basically you can look in that document for some of the core principles of what to do. And actually, Tara, if you remind me afterwards, we have a little, you've probably seen it, it's like a little 5-pager, really super short, on good practices in media. And I'd love for all of you to take a look at that, because it is not long at all. It's like 9 key principles, things you don't think about, like disabling geotagging, because you might take a picture of a child and a child predator could find where they are. And you don't even think about things like this. But I will give you an example. This is a personal example from real life. We lived in a certain location and became really good friends with a missionary. Amazing family, just really incredible. And when they had been raising support, they had put on their Facebook, like they were doing all of their stuff through their Facebook, all their support raising. And so everybody knew that they were moving to a certain country and a certain city. And within that city, they had actually talked about the children's home that they were going to move to help. They said, you know, like, help us raise this much support so we can go live at such and such children's home in this city, in this country. And about 2 years later, they were living in that city. They'd raised support. And I came across a post on their Facebook. And one of the parents had gone to the children's home with one of their children. And they had a picture of their child and one of the kids at the children's home. And it was like, you know, like, here's our child, you know, Jeremiah or Joseph or whatever. I think it was, you know, I'm not going to use their regular name, but their child was a boy, and was with another boy, you know, like Matthias. It's Joseph with Matthias, let's say. And, you know, this is our little buddy. He's a friend of ours. Didn't think anything of it, right? But we all know that the internet is not actually private. I hope we all know that your page on Facebook, there's all sorts of ways that people can see what's being posted, even if you want it to be private. So now imagine that I'm a child predator and I come across this and I say, oh, how great this is. Because now I can go to that country. I can go to that city. I can go to that children's home. I know what this kid looks like. And as this kid is leaving for church or school or whatever, I can say, hey, Matthias, so good to see you. I'm a friend of so-and-so. I'm a really good friend of them. They said to say hi. And all of a sudden I can get this kid's attention and make him think that I'm trustworthy. And of course that was done with good intentions, right? Like no one ever intended anything like that would happen. But these things can and do happen. And making sure that our people who come on short-term teams know your images, your stories, anything you share, 1, it belongs to that child. Make sure you have their permission. And number 2, it can have serious consequences because no one means for this to happen, but it does. That would be the final kind of principle we'll talk about. All right, I'm taking a drink because I've been talking a lot. I can't wait to hear your questions. If you haven't sent them in, now's the time. We're getting to the end of this. All right, so here's like where we get to the real practical, okay? Alternative models. And if you're sitting here going, ooh, some of the things we do that we really like, that we think have been really good, she's kind of saying they're not really a fit. What I want to encourage you to do is go to this document right here that Tara sent you, this 8 principles document, and it's kind of hefty, it's kind of chunky, okay? But the third part of it is case studies. We have case studies from actual organizations, real ones. We didn't make these things up, about kind of new models they're doing for care or for short-term missions. We also have 10 example models. Those ones were made up. They were made up with the help of a bunch of NGO leaders in a big workshop that I think Tara was at like a million years ago. And yeah, so you can get, I think there's about 16 different examples, some real life, some not, of things that you can do. And I highly encourage you to do that. You guys, this doesn't need to be rocket science. And keep in mind, we're, like I said earlier, we're in a really good time period to do this, okay? So because of COVID-19, because things will look different, right now is a good opportunity for you to gather your key stakeholders from your organization or your sending agency, whoever you're representing, and say, let's brainstorm how we might do something different here related to short-term missions, okay? So I'm gonna give you 5 examples of things you can do that can be really great. One is something that I already sort of touched on, taking something out to the church. Whatever you are doing in a children's home, try to take it out into the community. So maybe you're going each year and you're teaching English classes, or you're hosting a sports camp, or whatever you're doing. One thing I do just feel compelled to say that I had forgotten to say earlier is, one thing we would never suggest is that people would be doing caregiving activities on a short-term trip. So our short-termers shouldn't be doing things like feeding, bathing, changing diapers. That's for long-term caregivers, right? So most of the things that you would do if you're in a children's home, or even working with a small agency, we can take them to the church. If I'm going to do a VBS and I want to impact orphans and vulnerable children in a certain community, the first thing I'm going to do is find a church partner. And one that believes that kids are so valuable. Oftentimes I might ask the orphanage themselves and say, hey, who are the churches that are supporting you? Who are the churches that are involved? I'm gonna go to that church with the orphanage director and I'm gonna say, can we do something here for kids and families? Maybe we do a VBS. And we invite the kids from the orphanage and their caregivers. We invite kids in the community who might be at risk. We invite their caregivers. We're maybe doing something for the parents. We're doing something for the kids. We're maybe doing a community meal. Now we're impacting the parents and caregivers who care for kids long term. We're connecting them to the church. We're making the church the hero of the story. We're engaging church members in a way that they get the opportunity to serve. It's just win, 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 okay? And you don't have to do a VBS. It doesn't even need to be religious, okay? It could be a sports camp. It can be an English camp. One thing that I've seen that's been amazing is I really recommend family strengthening type things. So I know of one organization, they take at-risk families who have been referred to child welfare services, but who are intact. They take them on a camping trip. It's not very long, it's like a long weekend, but they take them to a camp. They're families that couldn't afford to do that. They keep them all together. I know another organization that does a lot of marriage conferences. So the church is doing the marriage conference, right? It's not the short-term team, but what the short-term team is doing is kind of everything that makes it go, makes it possible. They're helping to cook, they're helping to clean, they're helping to drive people back and forth and do transportation, things that maybe the church wouldn't have enough manpower to do, or woman power. A fundraising trip. This can be a really fun one. And sometimes people are like, what? So I know several organizations who they will bring teams to do something like, it's often like a marathon or like a long bike ride. So for example, an organization in Honduras, you might bring a team from the United States. They get sponsored. They get the thrill of travel. They want to travel. They want to see what's going on. Maybe if it were like Identity Mission, they might meet some of the families that are there. They might hear some stories, but then they're going to go out and they're going to run a marathon, and they've been sponsored by people in their home country, like maybe per mile. Maybe they're being sponsored by their grandma at like $5 per mile. If you run 26 miles, that's 120, is it 26? Yeah, $130 or whatever. And so they're like doing it as a fundraiser, and then all of the money will go to the organization. That's like very popular and gets a lot of good feedback. Education, so it can be like teaching a skill, it can be teaching English, it can be teaching woodworking. Now don't assume that somebody in the local community doesn't have that, okay? But it can be a short-term team helping to set up sort of a series of classes. Maybe the team raises some money so they can hire like a local carpenter, and they can hire a local weaver or whatever, but they're teaching some cool skills through that time together. facilitating a needed event. So this can be so many different types of things. I've seen this done a lot of different ways. Like I had mentioned, a marriage conference, that can be very popular, but it might be something that's more like the organization needs to do some sort of board meeting, or they need to have some sort of event in which the community is kind of processing something together. Maybe there's been a tragedy that's happened and people need to be able to have some counseling and some prayer. And so not the short-term team doesn't necessarily have to do those parts. They may not be equipped to do those parts, but they're there to make sure that the organization or the church or the long-term ministry has all of their things taken care of, providing food, providing prayer. I know one team that every single year they go to a specific conference and they prayer walk for 3 days. That is their entire trip. And literal miracles happen from it. And they love it. They raise money to do it. Crazy stuff happens. So that's another thing. Yeah, so just be creative. Look into those examples and don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel or get super crazy, like creative, or put a lot of money at it. Nothing like that. It can be really, really simple. And just start with one step. Start with one change. Maybe you try it with one team. Maybe you have 10 teams that come per year and you try it with one team, but start with baby steps. So for more on those things, I want you to feel free to check out these resources. We'll make sure that you have links to those. And then I'm going to just finish with COVID-19 stuff. I mean, what a wild year, right? This is the golden question. So what does COVID-19 mean for short-term missions? Well, it means a whole lot. I mean, it means that in 2020, there's a lot of short-term missions not happening. It means that it sort of feels like a crisis situation, and I think lots of people their knee-jerk reaction may be, especially if they partner with a ministry or church on the ground long-term, they may say, I need to get there. I need to make sure they're okay. They may feel that their presence is the number one most needed thing. And so here's where we want to talk a little bit about expectations and partnership, those two topics we mentioned before. Having those healthy relationships with partners and between partners, it makes this a really valuable opportunity to say, is it most important that we have a short-term team right now? Is their physical presence and the language skills they bring or the other skills they bring, is that the most important thing in this moment? Or is that something that we want to hit pause on for a minute? Is there a different way that the partners can contribute? And very frequently, what we'll hear is, on the one side, there's this great need. On the other hand, short-term missions can have sort of a variable return on investment, right? Where sometimes and in certain situations, they're super valuable, super helpful. Oftentimes those times are really stable. It's when your program, your organization, your church is in a really stable place. It can be very helpful to have a short-term team. But when we're in an unstable place where everything is new and everything's kind of, well, it feels a little wobbly, right? Where we're all kind of just guessing at these things and figuring it out. It may not be the time for that to happen. So what then do we do? Like, what, we want to work with our partners. We want to continue to engage them. And there are a couple of things that I would suggest with the acronym of CARE, if I can do this. There we go, CARE. So we want to work with our partners and help them understand that their physical presence may not be needed right this moment, but if it is, we want to think, carefully with them. But either way, we want to maintain this partnership. And remember, we talked about a power differential. Everybody needs to be able to say no, or not right now, or let's try this later. Everybody needs to be able to say, hey, this isn't a fit for us, so let's try this other thing and have a conversation. And that's the most important piece, right? In a partnership is that communication, that mutuality. So these are the 4 principles that I suggest when it comes to thinking about short-term missions in an era of COVID-19. The first is creativity. Help them think through how they can be creative and what creative solutions there might be. Maybe it's doing a virtual missions trip. Maybe it's setting something up so that, let's say you're doing foster care, the families there who have been engaged with a certain team in the past are able to do that virtually through FaceTime or whatever. There are lots of models now of virtual short-term missions trips. I encourage you to look them up. They can be a really interesting way actually to not just say, hey, the team that comes every year in October can't come this year, we're going to do a virtual missions trip, but actually that can help you to expand your audience a lot and help other people be connected to what God is doing through your long-term ministry on the ground. So think of it not just as a burden or something that's not going to work right, but really think of it as an opportunity to expand what you're doing. And think creatively, like what can they do? Maybe they are, maybe people in the United States or Europe or wherever your team might be typically coming from, maybe they can do a fundraiser. Maybe they can introduce you to the church that they're part of via teleconference, and you can have a conversation with the entire church. Maybe they can share a video or a story that you can produce so that they can understand what's going on and the good work that you're doing. Maybe you can teach them virtually how to make a certain recipe that is local to where you're at. And I can just imagine you're in a kitchen and they're in a kitchen, and it's kind of funny because people aren't that good at it. It would be fun, think creatively. What can you come up with that might be really outside the box? And also, just spoiler alert, as somebody who's had to do a lot of virtual teaching lately, there's a huge amount of grace for messing up. So take risks, go wild, be crazy, and just know that if only 70% of it goes well, people will just laugh and smile and go, oh, it's the pandemic. So it's a great opportunity right now to take risks with minimal risk of consequences. The second thing is ask. So if you are if you're a goer, if you're somebody who's setting up the teams and you're working with a partner, ask them, what do you actually need? Be humble. Say, hey, do you need us to come? Or actually, could there be something that's better? And you might, in your heart of hearts, be like, man, I really want to go. But be willing to listen and have them say, gosh, it could be really tricky. You might get stuck here. The borders might close, whatever. And have them say, what we really need right now is, all of our kids now have to be schooled in a different way. What we really need is 45 of this type of book, or whatever need you have. Let them know. The truth is, most partners really want to be helpful. And we as receiving organizations, those who receive short-term teams, sometimes do them a disservice because we think we can't suggest something different. And they're like, oh, wait, oh, that's what you want? Sure, we can totally do that. So ask. If you are the receiving organization, ask what they might like to do, how they might like to be involved. If they've seen any cool virtual things, give them some parameters. Say we can't have you visit right now because of XYZ. Is there anything else you'd like to be involved in? Get that conversation going. R is for restraint. In this moment, we can feel like this is forever. It's super important. This is even just as a psychologist worrying about people's mental health. Just remember, today is not permanent, okay? And for the sake of COVID-19 and feeling man, it's really rough and everything looks different and so on and so forth, think to yourself, it is okay for us to hold back a little bit, to restrain, to not run into trying to recreate what used to be, or recreate our old normal, or even develop a new normal. But it is okay to sit with the discomfort of saying, gosh, I really want this team to come, or I really want to go on a team, and it's not possible right now. It's okay for us to be cautious. So understand that caution is not a lack of faith. Sometimes we can feel if I don't just jump into something that's really nonsensical and illogical, it shows that I'm not using faith. No, it shows that you're using the good sense God gave you, okay? And there's no shame in that. So it's a tension to balance between making healthy, well-informed decisions and walking in faith. And don't feel like we need to jump into this overnight. Absolutely not. If it's not until next year, guess what? It's going to be fine. And the reason it's going to be fine comes in the E, it's eternity. Let eternity be your timeline. This is like a huge personal motto for me, irrespective of short-term missions. Fix my eyes on eternity. And the reason is when something feels like an emergency in the moment, which is like sometimes every 5 minutes in this work, which I'm sure you all get, where you're like, this thing is on fire and this thing's burning down, and what do we do? As long as I can fix my eyes on eternity, all of a sudden that puts it in perspective for me that this is not an emergency. It's actually not an emergency that a team would come, okay? It's not an emergency. I once heard Francis Chan say that eternity can be measured if you thought of a dove flying from heaven all the way to earth, and it took him 1,000 years. He picks up one grain of sand, he flies back, round trip 2,000 years. After he'd come to the earth, picked up every single grain of sand, one at a time, flew them back to heaven. That's the beginning of eternity. And so let's not let these temporal things like mess up our vision of what really is and what God is doing in the world. Guess what? I'm going to blow your mind here. God can actually take this situation with COVID-19 and improve your ministry. He can improve your funding. He can improve your partnerships. He can make your short-term missions better. He can, for sure, make the most important piece of this, which is the care for kids and families, far superior to what you had before this. So don't be discouraged by it and don't feel like, man, it ruined our plans. He's giving you a better plan. And I would just like camp out on that and trust him and walk forward in faith, and then call me when it turns out awesome, because I can't wait to hear. All right, so that was what I had. Now we can, do we have any questions, Tara? All right, let's stop sharing.
Yes, let me get back to the top. Okay. Our first one is, what advice would you give to an organization that has on-site team housing at a children's home?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would begin to look at an alternative solution. And in two ways. Firstly, one of the things you can do with a team that can be great in terms of housing, again, look at the local church. You want relationships that are symbiotic, that are mutual. Not just church in the United States serves organization in Honduras, but church in the United States and church in Honduras and organization in Honduras are working together to create something really beautiful, right? Like that's how God made us, for that sort of relationship. So in terms of where to house the team, I would say start looking at churches. What can they learn? How can they be engaged in the community? In terms of then how do you repurpose that team? Well, first of all, I'm guessing you're probably not going, man, we just have so much space. But, you know, one of the things I would say is I love family-based solutions. So you've got this team set up, right? Can you use that team setup to say, care for, do like emergency care for parents and children who are at risk? What if there's a domestic violence situation? Can moms and kids go there for a temporary period of time? Because it's, you know, ostensibly it's going to be a slightly bigger or like more open, perhaps, situation. So think about how can we repurpose this to actually benefit families in the community and expand our impact. So now by having teams go to churches and having families being cared for in what used to be team housing, it's just really powerful.
Can you speak more to power differentials with teams, potential teams? What advice would you give in graciously communicating with teams that have unrealistic expectations?
Well, I would start with prayer. Pray a lot. I think it's all about, it's about a couple things. One, first is the relationship, okay? So I would not say that, like, if I were developing a relationship and I were having a team that would come, I would want to get to know them before we'd ever even get to the point of saying, hey, why don't you come down, okay? and making sure that they're on the same page. I would write up some expectations. I think expectations done in writing are very powerful because people hear what they want to hear, but they can't deny what's written on paper, okay? So I would say, like, as your organization, what are your core values? What matters to you? What do you expect of teams? And it can be both, like, for example, here's our code of conduct, which you would have in your child protection policy. It can be things like, you know, these are the 5 values that our organization has that, you know, kind of drive our mission and vision. It can be things like, oh, even like how food is done, or, you know, how do you work things? And if you're able to have that established before you begin the conversation with a potential partner, they know what your deal breakers are. And if they can't abide by those deal breakers, it's cool. They're just not a fit for you. And that's fine. Not everyone is going to be. So that's the other piece, is like, let it be, get to the point where you can say no and feel comfortable with it. And then the other thing, I think, is getting at their motivation. So I'll give you a good example. I was working with a church, and they desperately wanted to work with orphans and vulnerable children, which is why they were consulting with me. And they were most worried about kids who were kind of aging out. So that was what they originally were thinking about. But then we started talking about like, what was their motivation in that? And they just were seeing so many who were traumatized, who really were having this super hard time integrating in the community. And at the end of it, when we started to tease apart their motivations and like what was underlying what they cared about most, they actually ended up doing some work around family preservation so that they could kind of stop some of this before it started. And what I would encourage you to do is help them identify, like, why do you think that this is a good fit for you? What are the things that you're trying to accomplish in it? And then if you're able to go from there, you can help them kind of build it up. So if their expectation is like, well, we want to come and rock babies, and you're like, you're not going to do that, they may be offended. But if you say, well, tell me, what are you hoping to do? And they're saying, we just see there's so much need, and we want to be involved in caring for kids. Well, okay, that's a wide field. We can do a lot with that. So go straight to their motivation and then work with them to see if it might be a fit. But don't be afraid to say no.
Okay, our next one is about screening. What are some suggestions for screening, background checks, things like that?
Definitely. Okay, so background checks. If you're working with a church, very frequently, if anybody has been working in children's ministry, they've had a background check. So you want one that's recent, for sure within the last 5 years. That's usually kind of the standard. And so if I'm working with a church, I'm going to say straight up to them, first of all, if I'm the organization on the ground, I'm not doing background checks for them. They need to submit one to me. And oftentimes I'll say to the church, do you have background checks for your volunteers? And typically they'll say yes. And I'll say, okay, then as part of their application, go ahead and send that with them. You know, it is an interesting thing too, especially if you're a child serving organization. One sort of screening, and you may or may not want to use this, but is whether or not they are engaged with serving kids in their local area. Like, to me, that's a real plus. That makes me think, okay, they're in it not just to travel. This is not, hey, I want to go there because it's my way to go to the beach. But really, I love to care for kids. I'm involved in things in my local church. That tells me that's a sign of maturity. So that would be one thing, like seeing what kinds of activities they've been involved in. If they're coming from a nation that doesn't have regular background checks, which given the sort of the setup of typical short-term missions is fairly rare, oftentimes you can do like a police check, which is like slightly different, or they know, you know, ask them, how would you typically do this? And then another thing I like to do, and it does take more work, but another thing I would like most organizations to be doing is background checks is for everyone, period, okay? Because whether or not you're officially working with vulnerable children, it's highly likely you're going to come upon some kid at some point, okay? If you are working directly with kids, there should be some sort of reference check as well. Because just, somebody that has supervised you or worked with you as you've worked with kids. If you've never worked with kids, go ahead and get some experience in your home country. That's fine. And the reason being, just because you have a clean background check does not mean you have any ability whatsoever to interact with kids in an appropriate way. And there are just some different principles about how we approach children, how we try to not be scary, not be intimidating. What types of things do you say in front of kids? What types of things don't you say? You want to make sure that people know that before they ever come, and you don't want to assume that they do unless they've had that experience.
That's good, Nicole. Our next one is, are there specific resources you would recommend for virtual service trips?
A good question. I do not know. I will look into it. What I'm thinking of is there are a couple of organizations you may know and you may want to reach out to about, and actually one of them, one of my staff members used to work for them, so I can get some information about what they did. But one is Open Arms International. They just did a virtual trip. And then Back to Back Ministries, is it Ministries? I think it's Back to Back Ministries, but it's back to back. They've done some of this, and they did something really cool that I would definitely recommend. I think this is so awesome. They set up a virtual service trip, and it was like at your own pace. So Open Arms was hosted. It was live, okay? Back to Back did one at your own pace. So they kind of set it up almost like an e-course, right? But at the end of it, you were connected to a live staff member, so you could ask any questions, so you could have discussion. And I thought that was super cool. So there's different models of how to do it. I will ask Laura whether or not they use any specific resources or tools. In fact, I'll write that down.
While you do that, Mac, I have your question here. I'm not sure if it got answered or not. Nicole, are you saying that short-term members should be reference checked?
If they are directly interacting with children, yes. Okay. And it should be a reference pursuant to whether or not they have actually been involved with kids. So, oh yeah, they help in Sunday school. Great. Well, is there a Sunday school director or like a co-teacher? That's all you need. It doesn't need to be like a fancy professionalized thing, but just making sure they have some experience with kids, because you all know, I mean, kids who are coming from traumatic backgrounds, if there were ever a group of kids who can push your buttons real quick, it's this one. So you want to make sure they have some basic skills before engaging with the population in which we serve.
I don't have any other questions. If anybody does have one, jump in. We've got a few more minutes before we get kicked off. I do want to reiterate something you mentioned briefly, Nicole, just because that's what we personally, we had to revamp our mission team practices when we started to get all of this learning and resources from KFO. And so it took a good, I feel like 2 years before we were totally revamped, had our mission team packet rewritten, child policy protections in practice. So if this takes you a couple years, do not feel like you're dropping the ball or whatnot, because it does. It takes a while. And anyway, the thing I think we had the most fun with and success with was what you mentioned with, don't shake that, I'm sorry, is getting the kids off campus, right? Like when we learned, hey, I'm not doing the best thing by bringing a team to interact with these kids. It's really hard to divert. If there's 20 kids, one caretaker, to divert their needs to the caretaker with a group of 20. And so like even trying to put that into practice was really hard. And so really getting them off campus into the community church, VBS, Vacation Bible School, is what we did. it was fun. It was great. Then the local church connected and started talking to those caretakers, and just different things happened more than just the kids getting to play and have fun with their caretakers going with them from station to station. And of course, our team was run ragged and had a great time because they were keeping up with the snacks and the craft materials. And so everybody was super interactive in the best way, right? And so just reiterating that, you did mention it, but just wanted to reiterate that because that was our favorite transformation, so to speak, with our groups.
It is so fun to see when you move your teams out into the community, your impact multiplies very quickly, and crazy things like start to work themselves out. Like I've seen a situation like yours where actually a bunch of the older youth ended up sort of developing these kind of natural mentorship relationships then with people in the church, because what would happen is the orphanage would take the kids to church on Sunday, but it was just for service. So like they were never really mingling with church members. And then all of a sudden, they were like going to these people's houses for Christmas and whatever. So then they age out and now they have this place to belong. And it was all because, literally, it was because they took their short-term teams and had them start doing things through the local church. And it was like it was an area where they had, you know, kind of a plaza or whatever, like a central square. And that was where it is. It was open for everyone. And they had way more people than they had expected. So that's the only caveat. Like it could get a little bigger. You could have a little more impact than you anticipated, but it's really fun. And yeah, I just recommend it. Any other questions, guys? Speak now, or actually you could email. I was going to say forever hold your peace, but whatever. You're fine. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining today. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you've been able to learn some things. One note is, in addition to all these like short-term missions resources that we're sharing that are free, some are in Spanish, we also have tons of other resources, and we're in the process right now of actually redoing our website. So we have I think we have like 16 things right now that are in Spanish. We've been just like translating like crazy, and we've got tons of resources, and all of the resources from this Department of K4 are free. So if there's anything that you want to check out, please do.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. And I will, if you registered for the webinar, we already have your email, and you'll get the recording of this and all the resources that Nicole mentioned. If you just jumped on with that last minute link, if you will email your email to admin@identitymission.org, Nicolina will make sure that you get all of this as well. So thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great day.